Hello, this is Ron Willauer, and we are on lesson 3 on Jesus' Discourse from the Mount of Olives, where he says things about the future. I have here to start out with the 3 parallel passages where Jesus talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, and the disciples ask him the question about when this will happen, what will be the sign. And to start off, I'll just read it so we're familiar with what we're looking at. Matthew 24, 1-3 says, Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down. And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? That's from Matthew. Here's from Mark. As he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Teacher, behold what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. And Jesus said to him, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another which will not be torn down. And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew were questioning him privately. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? And then we'll do Luke. We'll read from what's recorded there. Luke 21, verses 5-7. And while some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, as for these things which you are looking at, the days will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another which will not be torn down. They questioned him, saying, Teacher, when therefore will these things happen? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? Now, in all 3 of these passages, Jesus talked about the temple being destroyed, that there would not be one stone left upon another. This event occurred in 70 AD when the Roman general Titus defeated Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. Now, could it be referring to another future destruction of the temple? I think from the whole context, as we go through things, I would say no. He was warning his disciples right then, as we go on later, that they needed to flee. He says there'll be wars and rumors of wars, and when you see these things, and he says, you are about to hear wars and rumors of war. In the original language, it's something that was going to happen, that they would experience. So I believe this, when Jesus talks about one stone upon another, and that actually happened in 70 AD, that's what he was referring to here. That's what he was predicting. So also when you read these passages, you see that there were 2 questions asked of Jesus. One was, when will these things happen? Give us an idea how long it will be. And the other one, what will be the sign? Okay, what will we see happen that will also give us an idea that these things are about to happen? And Jesus will answer those, and we'll look at his response as we go further. So when the disciples asked about when these things would be, there not being one stone left upon another, I think is pretty obviously included, because that is exactly the statement that he made that prompted them to ask the question, when will these things happen? But they didn't say, when will this happen? When will this thing happen? So it's not necessarily limited to the destruction of Jerusalem. And I think the fact they said these things means that it's other events other than the destruction of Jerusalem they're asking about. Well, what could those events be? if that's the case. And you have to consider that the last lesson we looked at the end of Matthew 23, and Jesus talked about their house being left desolate. He talked about that he would send witnesses to the Jewish leaders and they would persecute them and kill them. And he talked about being seen again. I'm going to scroll down so we can see the last couple verses of Matthew. That says 24, but it's 23. I'll have to correct that. So Matthew 23, verses 38 to 39. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. Well, as I said then, I believe that is him predicting the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, that was the last time he was at the temple, and desolate can mean deserted, and it can refer to Jesus would no longer come back. But the next verse he says, for I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So this event of Jesus being seen again, and they would say, blessed be he who comes in the name of the Lord, I believe is one of the events that falls under these things when the disciples asked, when will these things be? So you have to realize that this verse here and their question in Matthew 24 happened in fairly short order. These verses at the end of Matthew 23 record what happened at the temple, and Jesus speaking to the Jewish leaders. He leaves the temple, goes to the Mount of Olives, sits down, and his disciples come to him, and then he proceeds on, and they say, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign? So I believe that it includes more than the destruction of Jerusalem that they're asking about, that these things being plural, and the destruction of Jerusalem would have been singular, this thing. So when we consider this quote, well, let me point 4 here. I wanted to keep the verse up there so you can see it too. When you consider the quote, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, that speaks of a positive event. It's quoted from Psalm 118:26, and if you read that whole psalm, it's not speaking of judgment and destruction, but of God coming through for his people and they rejoicing in it, that type of thing. And also we saw in the last lesson that this verse, the phrase from that verse in Psalm 118 was spoken of by the people that received Jesus and greeted him as he was entering Jerusalem for the last time, often called his triumphal entry. And they were responding to him as a king and greeting him as a king. He was riding a donkey, and Zechariah talks, behold, your king comes to you, humble, meek, riding on a donkey. Not exact quote. And so this is speaking of Jesus coming as a king. Well, that triumphal entry had already occurred. So when Jesus said, you're going to say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, he's speaking of something in the future, not something that had already occurred in the past. So I believe he's speaking of a future coming as king. We'll go on here and look at point number 5, is that the preterist view is that the coming of which he spoke is his coming to judge the Jewish people by the hands of the Romans, and that the end of the age is the end of the age of the Jewish sacrificial system. So, some verses say what will be the end of the world, not the end of the age, but it's really eon, which is the end of the age. There's an age, and they were in the age of, they had a temple, they were doing sacrifices, and that age ended when Jerusalem was destroyed. So you can see where they could get that. But there was another age they were in, which was the age of being ruled over by the Romans in particular, but being ruled over by Gentiles and not having their own Jewish king rule over them. And I believe that's the age that he's speaking of that was going to end. Well, if you take into account these things are referring to this, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord, which is a king, coming of a king. I think that makes more sense. And as we go through the Olivet Discourse further, there's other things I think really that it makes sense. And in particular, when he says, therefore flee when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. And because he had said, we'll look at this more, but people were going to come saying, I am he, and the end is near. Well, if that end is the end of the Roman rule, there's people coming and saying, hey, I'm the guy that's going to do it. We're going to defeat the Romans. And Jesus says, no, the end is not yet. These things are going to happen, and then the end will come. Therefore, flee. It makes a lot of sense to me that what he's talking about is the end of the Roman rule. Now, this last point of 5, that this was likely the mindset because the people were looking for a Messiah to come as king and deliver them from the rule of the Romans, is true. The preterist view about the end of the temple system and that whole age, that was kind of a new thought to them. Jesus is bringing this up when he says there's not one stone going to be left upon another. But it wasn't the common mindset and common thing they were looking to happen. So, the common mindset was, hey, there's a Messiah that's going to come and he'll defeat the Romans and he'll be the king and we'll have our own self-rule again. And they were looking for that because Daniel predicted the 4 world kingdoms, the Roman Empire being the 4th one, and during the Roman Empire time, their Messiah would come and so, hey, he's going to come, he's going to defeat the Romans. That was a very common mindset. So Acts 1:6 indicates this. So when they had come together, they were asking him, saying, Lord, is it at this time you are restoring the kingdom to Israel? So after Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, but before his ascension, here he is before them as a resurrected Messiah. And they were thinking, well, maybe this is when he's going to restore the kingdom. I mean, he's got all this power and he's glorious, and wow, he could take on the Romans and it wouldn't be any problem. But anyhow, the idea is the mindset here is they were still looking for him to restore the kingdom to Israel. And I think they were under that mindset when they were asking him about when these things would be. The futurist view is that his coming and the end of the age refers to his bodily return to earth. Now, I believe it does, but that wasn't what was in the mind of the disciples. They didn't understand a bodily return. That wasn't in their mind at all, because they didn't understand he's going to be crucified and resurrected and ascended to have opportunity to bodily return. That was not yet in their mindset. So they really weren't asking when will that happen, when will this bodily return happen, but I think it's still the idea of when will you come as king. I believe that his coming as king is simultaneous with or the same event as him descending from earth to earth again bodily, but they weren't thinking that way. So I think this still indicates they were just asking when will you be king and defeat our enemies and all. So that just gives some idea of what the question was about. What were they asking? When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming? I believe they were asking about more than just the destruction of Jerusalem. It was all the things that Jesus had just talked about. And we'll see later what his response is. So thank you for listening, and I hope you join next time as we move on.